The ranch sat far from the main road, surrounded by wide open land that seemed to stretch forever. Dust rose gently whenever the wind passed, and the tall grass moved like waves in a quiet sea. This land belonged to a man named Henry, a rancher who had lived alone for many years. People in the nearby town knew his name, but very few truly knew him. He spoke little, kept his head down, and focused only on his work. To most, he was just the lonely rancher on the edge of the county. Henry woke up before sunrise every day. The morning light usually found him already outside, checking fences, feeding animals, or fixing something that had broken during the night. His life followed the same pattern every day, and he liked it that way. Routine helped him keep his thoughts in order. Silence helped him avoid memories that still felt heavy in his chest. Years ago, Henry had not been alone. He had a small family and a house filled with laughter. But life had taken a different turn, one he never expected. Loss came quietly and stayed loudly. After that, Henry chose distance over company. He moved farther from town, bought land where voices could not reach him, and built a life that required no one else. The town respected him, but they also avoided him. Some said he was cold. Others said he carried sadness that made people uncomfortable. A few believed he simply wanted nothing to do with anyone. Henry never corrected them. Letting people believe what they wanted was easier than explaining the truth. As the sun climbed higher, Henry worked steadily, his movements calm and practiced. He rarely stopped unless his body demanded it. By late afternoon, the sky began to soften into warm colors, and the air cooled just enough to bring relief. Henry finished his last task and headed back toward the house, expecting nothing more than a quiet evening. But that evening was different. As Henry approached his front porch, he noticed something unusual. A figure stood near the gate, tall and still, as if unsure whether to step forward or turn back. At first, Henry thought it might be a stranger who had lost their way. Visitors were rare, but not impossible. He slowed his steps, watching carefully. The figure was a woman. She stood taller than most people Henry had known, with broad shoulders and a strong frame shaped by hard work. Her clothes were simple and worn, marked by dust and long days outdoors. She held her hands together tightly, as if trying to hold herself steady. Even from a distance, Henry could sense her hesitation. He stopped a few steps away and waited. He did not speak right away. Silence had always been his way of understanding people. Finally, the woman lifted her head and met his eyes. There was something in her expression that caught him off guard. It was not fear, nor anger, but exhaustion mixed with quiet hope. She took a step forward. Henry noticed how carefully she moved, as though she had learned to be cautious in every situation. When she spoke, her voice was low but clear. "I'm sorry to come without notice," she said. "I was told you might listen." Henry studied her face. She looked tired in a way that sleep could not fix. Her eyes carried the weight of many sleepless nights. He could tell she had walked a long distance. And not just in miles. He nodded slightly, signaling for her to continue. "My name is Margaret," she said. "I live a few miles east of here. Or, I used to." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I didn't know where else to go." Henry opened the gate and stepped aside, giving her space to enter the property. It was not an invitation spoken aloud, but it was clear enough. Margaret hesitated for only a moment before stepping through. As they stood there, the evening wind passed between them. The animals nearby grew quiet, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Henry felt something stir inside him, a feeling he had pushed away for years. He did not like it, but he did not turn away. Margaret explained that she was a widow. Her husband had passed not long ago, leaving her to manage the land alone. People often judged her by her size and strength, assuming she did not need help. Some even feared her, calling her a giant behind her back. They did not see the loneliness that followed her every step, or the pressure she carried quietly. She spoke without tears, but her pain was clear. She told him how others had tried to take advantage of her situation, how her land had suddenly become valuable to people who never cared before. When she stood up for herself, They laughed. When she asked for help, doors closed. "I was told you were fair," she said softly. "That you understand what it means to lose and still keep going." Henry looked away toward the open land. Her words struck closer than he expected. He had not realized how much his story had spread, or how visible his silence had become to others. He said nothing for a long moment. Margaret waited, her hands still clasped, her shoulders stiff. She seemed ready to leave if he asked her to. Finally, Henry spoke. "You can rest here tonight," he said simply. "We'll talk more in the morning." Margaret's breath caught slightly, as if she had not expected even that much. She nodded, her eyes lowering in quiet gratitude. As Henry turned toward the house, he wondered why he had made that choice so quickly. He had spent years avoiding involvement. Yet here he was, opening his land to a stranger. He told himself it was temporary. Just one night. Just kindness. But deep down, he knew something had already changed. That night, the ranch felt different. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with unspoken stories, shared pain, and the quiet understanding between two people who had learned to survive alone. Neither of them knew it yet, but this meeting was the first step toward a moment that would soon shock everyone who thought they understood Henry the rancher. And as the stars filled the sky, both carried the same unspoken thought sometimes. The most unexpected knock at the door changes everything. Morning arrived slowly at the ranch. The sky turned pale orange as the sun rose over the open land, and a cool breeze moved through the grass. Henry was already awake, as he always was. Habit pulled him out of bed before his mind could form any real thoughts. For a brief moment, he forgot that someone else was on his land. Then he heard the soft sound of movement inside the house, and the memory returned. Margaret was there. Henry stepped outside to wash his face at the pump. The cold water cleared his head, but not the quiet questions forming inside him. He was not used to having a guest, especially one who came with trouble following close behind. Still, he felt no regret, only a strange sense of responsibility he could not fully explain. Inside, Margaret moved carefully, as if afraid to disturb anything. She had not slept much. The unfamiliar place and the weight of her worries kept her awake. When Henry entered the kitchen, she looked up quickly. "Good morning," she said. "Morning," Henry replied. He poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one in front of her without asking. She accepted it with both hands, warming her fingers around the cup. For a few moments, they sat in silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but it was heavy. Finally, Henry spoke. "You said you used to live east of here." Margaret nodded. "My husband and I built that place together. It wasn't much at first, just land and a small house. But we worked hard. Every fence post, every wall, we put it up ourselves." Her voice remained steady, but her eyes drifted toward the window, as if she could still see the place in her mind. "After he passed," she continued, "everything changed. People who never spoke to us before started showing up. They said they wanted to help, but it didn't take long to see their true reasons." Henry listened closely. He did not interrupt. "They offered money," she said. "Not fair money. Just enough to make it sound reasonable to someone desperate. When I refused, they tried other ways. Pressure, threats, lies." She paused and took a slow breath. "They think because I'm alone, I'll break." Henry felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He knew that kind of pressure. Loss did not end when the person was gone. It echoed through every part of life afterward. "Why come to me?" he asked. Margaret met his eyes. "Because you don't belong to them, because you live outside their reach, and because people say you don't scare easy." Henry looked down at his hands. They were rough and scarred, shaped by years of work. He had never thought of himself as brave. He had simply learned how to endure. After breakfast, Henry went about his usual chores. Margaret offered to help, and though he hesitated, he eventually agreed. She worked with strength and focus, clearly used to physical labor. Watching her, Henry saw more than just her size. He saw determination, discipline, and a deep understanding of the land. As they worked, Margaret spoke more. She told him about her husband, how kind he was, how they dreamed of growing old on that land. She spoke of quiet evenings, shared meals, and plans that never had the chance to become real. Henry did not share much about himself, but Margaret did not push. She seemed to understand that some stories took time. By midday, a truck appeared on the dirt road leading to the ranch. Henry noticed it immediately. Visitors were rare, and unexpected ones even more so. The truck stopped near the gate, and two men stepped out. Margaret froze, her body stiffened, and her face lost color. Henry noticed instantly. "They're from town," she said quietly. "They've been coming around a lot." The men approached with confident steps, scanning the property as if it already belonged to them. One of them smiled when he saw Henry. "Didn't expect company out here," the man said. Henry stood straight and calm. "This is private land." The other man glanced at Margaret. "We were hoping to speak with her." "She's my guest," Henry replied. The men exchanged looks. Their smiles faded slightly. "We're just trying to settle some business," one of them said. "Nothing serious." Margaret stepped forward despite the tension. "I told you already. I'm not selling." One man laughed lightly. "Everyone sells eventually." Henry felt something shift inside him. The quiet patience he carried every day hardened into something firmer. "She said no," he said. "That should be enough." The men hesitated. Henry's calm presence unsettled them. This was not a man they could easily pressure. "This isn't over," one of them said, as they turned back toward the truck. Henry watched until the vehicle disappeared down the road. Only then did he turn to Margaret. "They won't stop," she said softly. "Not until they get what they want." Henry nodded. He already knew that. That evening, they sat on the porch as the sky darkened. Margaret looked tired, but there was relief in her expression. "You didn't have to step in," she said. Henry stared out at the land. "I know." There was another silence, longer this time. "I've spent years keeping to myself," he finally said. "Telling myself it was enough. That staying away kept things simple." "Just it." Margaret listened closely. "But simple isn't always right," he continued. "Sometimes it's just easier." She nodded slowly. "I've learned that too." As night fell, Henry realized that helping Margaret would not be simple. It would bring attention, conflict, and choices he had avoided for years. But he also realized something else. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel empty. Margaret was not just asking for help. She was reminding him of something he had lost sight of: purpose. As the stars appeared overhead, Henry made a quiet decision. He did not say it aloud yet, but it was clear in his mind. He would not turn away. Not this time. And far beyond the ranch, word had already begun to spread that the lonely rancher was no longer standing alone. The next few days passed with a quiet tension that never fully lifted. Life at the ranch continued, but everything felt sharper, more alert. Henry woke early each morning. Yet now his thoughts were not only about fences and animals. They were about Margaret, the men who had come to the gate, and the trouble that seemed to be moving closer. Step by step, Margaret stayed busy. She helped with the animals, repaired old tools, and cleaned areas of the house Henry had long ignored. She did not act like a guest who planned to leave soon. At the same time, she never assumed she belonged there. Every move she made carried respect, as if she knew she was walking on borrowed ground. Henry noticed this. He noticed many things about her. She worked without complaint. When something was difficult, she faced it head on. But sometimes, when she thought Henry was not looking, he saw the tiredness return to her face. In those moments, her strength faded just enough to show the pain beneath it. One afternoon, while fixing a broken fence together, Margaret finally spoke about what scared her most. "They won't stop," she said, pulling the wire tight. "They've done this before. They wear people down." Henry tied the wire and nodded. "They're counting on you feeling alone." She looked at him. "I was alone. Until I came here." The words stayed with him longer than he expected. Later that day, Henry rode into town for supplies. It was something he avoided unless necessary. The town had not changed much, but the way people looked at him had. Whispers followed him as he walked past the store. He heard his name spoken softly, mixed with curiosity and surprise. Inside the store, conversation stopped for a moment. Then they slowly resumed, quieter than before. Henry kept his focus on what he needed. As he reached the counter, the shop owner leaned closer. "Word is you've taken someone in," the man said carefully. Henry met his eyes. "I gave help where it was needed." The shop owner nodded slowly. "Just be careful. Some folks don't like it when things don't go their way." Henry paid and left without another word. Outside, he saw the same truck from before parked across the street. One of the men leaned against it, watching him. Their eyes met briefly. The message was clear. When Henry returned to the ranch, Margaret could tell something was wrong. "They know," she said. "Yes," Henry replied, "and they want me to feel it." That evening, they talked longer than usual. Not just about the problem, but about their pasts. Henry spoke of his family for the first time in years. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with care. Margaret listened without interruption. "I thought keeping my distance would protect me," Henry said. "But it only kept me stuck." Margaret looked down at her hands. "After my husband passed, I thought being strong meant doing everything alone. Now I see it just made the weight heavier." Their shared understanding grew quietly, without promises or plans, just truth. The following morning, another visitor arrived. This time, it was someone Henry recognized from town. An older man named Samuel, who owned nearby land. He approached carefully, hat in hand. "I heard what's going on," Samuel said. "Didn't sit right with me." Henry studied him. Most people didn't want to get involved. Samuel sighed. "Fear spreads faster than sense, but it also fades when someone stands up." Margaret watched from the porch, surprised. Samuel explained that others had faced similar pressure in the past, but had given in quietly. He admitted he had done the same. "I wish I hadn't," he said. His visit changed something. It showed that people were watching, and not everyone agreed with what was happening. That afternoon, Henry and Margaret discussed their options. Leaving was one, giving up was another. Neither felt right. "If I run," Margaret said, "they win, and they'll do it again to someone else." Henry nodded. "And if I stay silent, I become part of the problem." The weight of the decision settled between them. This was no longer just about land. It was about choice. Later that night, Henry stood alone outside, looking over the ranch. The stars were bright, the land quiet. This place had been his shelter from the world. Now it was becoming something else. A stand. He realized that helping Margaret meant stepping fully back into a world he had avoided. It meant being seen, judged, challenged. For years, he had believed peace came from distance. Now, he understood that real peace sometimes came from facing what you fear. Inside the house, Margaret packed and unpacked the same small bag, unsure what tomorrow would bring. She did not want to be a burden, but she also knew she could not face this alone anymore. When Henry came back inside, he spoke clearly. "I'm going to town tomorrow," he said. "Not for supplies, to talk." Margaret looked up. "Talk to who?" "To anyone who will listen," he replied. "They've been acting in shadows." "I won't." She searched his face. "You don't have to do this for me." "I know," Henry said. "I'm doing it because it's time." That night, neither slept much. Morning came faster than expected. As Henry prepared to leave, Margaret stood at the door. "Whatever happens," she said, "thank you for not turning away." Henry paused. "You reminded me who I used to be." He rode toward town with a steady purpose, unaware of how many eyes were already watching, or how his next steps would change far more than just one life. By the time the sun reached its highest point, one thing was certain. The lonely rancher was no longer choosing silence, and the moment everyone would soon talk about was drawing closer. Henry reached town before noon. The streets looked the same as always, but the feeling was different. People noticed him right away. Some paused mid-step, others turned their heads to follow him. The lonely rancher did not usually walk through town with purpose. Today, he did. He tied his horse near the square and walked toward the small meeting hall beside the store. It was not a grand place. Just a simple building where people gathered when something important needed to be discussed. Henry stood outside for a moment, steadying himself. For years, he had avoided places like this. Silence had been easier. But silence had also allowed others to suffer quietly. Inside, a few townspeople were already there. Some recognized him and looked surprised. Murmurs spread through the room like a soft ripple. Henry did not wait for an invitation. He stepped forward and spoke clearly. "I'm here because something is wrong," he said. "And pretending it's not won't fix it." The room grew quiet. He talked about Margaret without using her name at first. He spoke of a widow left to protect her land alone. He spoke of pressure, unfair offers, and fear used as a tool. His voice was calm, not angry, but firm. People listened because he did not exaggerate. He did not accuse. He told the truth as he had seen it. Then he said her name. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. They had heard rumors. Now they were hearing the full story. "She asked for help," Henry continued. "Not because she's weak, but because no one should have to stand alone when they're being pushed aside." A man near the back spoke up. "It's not our business." Henry looked at him. "It becomes our business when silence helps the wrong thing grow." There was no argument after that. Only quiet thought. By the time Henry left the hall, word had spread. People stood outside, watching him with new eyes. Some looked unsure. Some looked relieved. A few even looked ashamed. Across the street, the truck was parked again. The same two men stood nearby. This time, they did not smile. One stepped forward. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." Henry stopped. "No. You did that." The man's expression hardened. "You think standing up like this changes anything?" Henry met his gaze. "It already has." He walked past them without another word. Back at the ranch, Margaret waited. Every sound made her tense. When she finally saw Henry returning, her breath released slowly. She could tell something had changed, just by the way he moved. "They know now," he said. "All of them." Margaret swallowed. "Is that good?" "It's necessary," Henry replied. That night, lights appeared on the road leading to the ranch. A few neighbors arrived quietly. Samuel was among them. They did not come with plans or promises. They came to show presence, to show that Margaret was not alone. Margaret stood on the porch, overwhelmed. She had spent months feeling invisible. Then suddenly she was seen. The following days brought pressure. Letters arrived. Warnings disguised as advice. People tried to convince Henry to step back, to let things settle quietly. He read each one and set them aside. Then came the meeting everyone talked about. The men pushing Margaret decided to make their move public. They announced a gathering, claiming they had legal support and backing. They expected people to stay away. They expected fear. Instead, the hall filled. Henry arrived with Margaret. Gasps followed them as they entered together. The tall widow and the once silent rancher stood side by side. The sight alone unsettled those who thought they had control. One of the men began speaking, explaining their claims in smooth words. Margaret listened, her hands steady. When it was her turn, she stood. "I worked for my land," she said. "With my husband. And after him. No one here can say otherwise." Then Henry stood. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply spoke. "I know what it's like to lose," he said. "I know what it's like to be told to move on, to give up, to stay quiet. But quiet only helps those who push hardest." The room was still. "I won't stand aside anymore," he continued. "Not today. Not again." The reaction was immediate. People spoke up. Questions were asked. Stories surfaced. Others shared similar experiences they had never dared to voice. The men lost control of the room. By the end of the meeting, nothing was settled on paper. But everything had changed in spirit. The pressure was no longer hidden. It was exposed. Outside, as people left, Margaret turned to Henry. Her eyes were full, but she did not cry. "You didn't just help me," she said. You gave them courage. Henry nodded slowly. Someone once did the same for me. I just forgot. That night, the ranch was quiet again, but it felt different from before. It was not empty. It was strong. Henry sat alone for a while, thinking. He knew the road ahead was not finished. There would be more challenges. But the hardest step had already been taken, choosing to act. Inside the house, Margaret rested more peacefully than she had in months. For the first time since her loss, hope felt real, not fragile. And in town, people talked, not about fear, but about the moment the lonely rancher stood up, and everything shifted. The action everyone would remember had already happened. The days after the meeting felt slower, but heavier. The noise had faded, yet its echo remained everywhere. People spoke differently in town now. They watched more closely. They listened more carefully. What had once been whispered was now said in open daylight. That change alone made a difference. Henry returned to his routine. But it was no longer empty. Each morning still began before sunrise. Yet now, Margaret worked beside him. Not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone rebuilding her strength. They moved through the days with steady focus, aware that peace did not mean the struggle was over. It only meant it had changed form. The pressure did not disappear all at once. A few attempts were made to stir fear again. Quiet messages arrived, suggesting compromise, urging Henry to step away and let matters settle. He ignored them. Margaret did the same. Fear no longer had the same grip. It had been exposed, and once exposed, it lost much of its power. Samuel and a few others continued to visit. They helped repair fences, shared meals, and spoke openly about protecting one another. It was not an organized movement, just people choosing not to look away anymore. That choice spread quietly, like roots growing underground. One afternoon, Margaret received official confirmation that her land was secure. It came in the form of simple words, written plainly. No celebration followed. No loud joy. She read it twice, then sat down slowly. Henry watched from across the room. It's done, she said. He nodded, understanding that done did not erase the pain that came before it. But it did close a door that had been pressing against her for too long. Margaret stepped outside and stood in the open land. The wind moved through the grass, familiar and comforting. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, letting the weight lift little by little. For the first time since her husband's passing, the future did not feel like something chasing her. It felt like something waiting. That evening, she and Henry sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The sky turned soft with color. You could go back now, Henry said gently, if you want. Margaret smiled faintly. I know. But I don't need to rush. They sat quietly, not speaking much. Words were no longer required to fill the space between them. Weeks passed. Margaret returned to her land. But she was not alone there anymore. Help came without asking. Sometimes it was a shared tool. Sometimes it was a simple check-in. The fear that once surrounded her had lost its voice. Henry returned to being the rancher people had always known, but something about him was different. He spoke more. He listened more. He did not hide behind silence anymore. In town, people still talked about what happened, but the tone had shifted. The story was no longer about pressure or control. It was about a man who had chosen to stand when no one expected him to. Henry never called himself brave. When someone thanked him, he shrugged it off. I just did what needed doing, he said. But those who watched knew better. They had seen a man step out of long-held isolation and choose responsibility over comfort. They had seen how one decision could ripple outward, changing more than just one life. One evening, months later, Margaret returned to the ranch with a basket of fresh bread. She walked up the familiar path with ease now. The place no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like part of her story. They shared a simple meal. Laughter came easily, without effort. You know, Margaret said, people still call me a giant. Henry smiled. Does it bother you? She shook her head. Not anymore. Now I know strength isn't what they thought it was. Henry looked out over the land. It never is. As night settled, stars filled the sky. The ranch was quiet, but not lonely. It carried a sense of balance that had been missing for years. Henry thought about the man he had been when Margaret first arrived. Closed off. Tired. Convinced that distance was safety. He realized now that distance had only protected his pain, not his peace. Margaret had reminded him that helping someone else could also heal parts of yourself you thought were gone. The story spread beyond the town eventually. It was told simply. A widow asked for help. A rancher listened. And when it mattered, he stood. No dramatic ending followed. No grand reward. Just a community that learned something important. That courage does not always shout. Sometimes, it opens a gate.